welcome people who came a little bit later. Thank you for coming. So I was going to try to speak for about 10 or 15 minutes, trying to provide some of the context. And as I mentioned, that this is based on a lot of the work, actually starting from about 2000, 2001, when I was asked by the Chiefs of Ontario to prepare the traditional knowledge component for their submission to Walkerton. And a lot of the teachings and, I guess, central principles of how to think about how we relate to water that came from elders. So I wanted to acknowledge them because some of them have passed on. So this isn't like me being an academic who thought of these things. They literally came from people and from the community and shared it. And then I kind of see my job to then share that with others. So the first thing I want to say is, so this recent concern around water that the state, Canada, and Ontario, and others have is not new to Indigenous peoples. Waters has always been really important. For thousands and thousands of years, people have been here, had their own laws, had their own governance, had their own relationship with the water. So it's not new. And our knowledge and laws around water are not new either. What's different is that people are now interested in this because clearly the other system is not working that well at protecting water, so it's necessary to look at other knowledges that have, well, in my view, a proven track record. So, water is life was a very central theme that came out, and I'll show you this because I may not have time later, and I may not remember later. Is you can find this report, because it has a lot of what I'm talking about, Aboriginal traditional knowledge and source water protection, that Sue and I worked on many years ago for Chiefs of Ontario, where a lot of the elders, probably maybe around 40 to 60 different elders from across Ontario. And I did bring a copy of Aimee's report that you can find online on the water law, because again, she worked with a lot of elders, and you'll see a lot of synergy between what people were saying around appropriate ways of relating to water. So that's just my dad and my son's fishing. So, not top secret, big water crisis, becoming worse and worse with climate change. So World Water Reports come out, speak to this issue, climate change reports. And Indigenous peoples have still struggled to have your voices heard even at the international level. So here I just compiled just different water declarations that Indigenous peoples have put forward around the world, and you see a lot of similarities. So like I know the Anishinaabe context the best, and Ontario context the best, but when I look at the international declarations, I can see that there's similarities. This how water is understood and what our responsibilities are to water. So those are just some examples. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples also refers to responsibilities and rights to water. And in this article specifically speaking to the obligations to future generations. So I'm going to go through this more quickly than I would want to. So water governance and policy. And not a top secret again that there's a huge problem with water in Canada in relation to Indigenous peoples, but primarily First Nations because of the unique situation that First Nations face. It's an environmental justice issue because Indigenous peoples don't enjoy the same level of protection as other peoples in Canada. The state has tried to respond to this through the First Nations Water Management Strategy, Expert Panel, Protocol for Safe Drinking Water. Basically, the First Nations Water Wastewater Action Plan is exactly the same as the First Nations Water Management Strategy, but when the Conservative government came in, they just like stuck action on everything and called it something new, but it wasn't. And then the Clean Water Act, and then the new, well not new, 2013 Safe Drinking Water Act for First Nations, which is currently being revisited because it really wasn't done in appropriate consultation with First Nations, and nor was it really take the recommendations that came out of the expert panel seriously. So they're revisiting that, and I suspect will be a major topic of conversation at the upcoming water forum. So First Nations don't have the same level of protection in First Nations, which is why they're trying to create an act that nobody wants. The federal and environmental protection regimes are failing First Nations. And I always have to point this out because Sue and I worked on a source water protection plan in my community, and whatever they're called now, INAC, different names, different iterations, they have a source water protection protocol, and it's just like really awful, it doesn't work. So we had to, but there's one in place, but there's no funding for First Nations to actually do planning and governance around protecting water in their communities. So in a lot of the work that I've done, so some key themes that come out are water is considered to be a relative entity, and you would take care of water in that way. That to me has huge implications for governance, because why would you govern your relatives? But that's a hard thing for people to wrap their heads around. Traditional knowledge is really important, and I'll talk again about what some elders and grandmothers and grandfathers identified, and that there's an ethic of responsibility that's central in a lot of the work that people talked about in relation to a relationship to water. So there's Sylvia in this picture. I always like to talk about the work that grandmother Josephine Bondaman does, because basically her work was realizing those responsibilities. She wasn't as concerned about what the governments were doing, because it's like, whatever, I'm going to realize my responsibilities. It's a very different way of approaching the work that she did. So what I've been taught so far, and I suspect there's like so many elements and so many scales and so much more to how we understand water. So we speak about the 4 elements. So water you don't really ever even think about in isolation. It's always in relation to the other elements, fire, earth, and wind. And also what we understand water to be, again, like this is just tip of the iceberg. There's like so many other teachings and learning that has to happen. But what I've been taught, and I suppose what I can handle so far is a big part of it, is water is understood to be, because we tend to think about water as like drinking water, because that's what consumes the state in terms of providing citizens safe drinking water, but water is a lot more than that. There's water that comes from the sky, for example, rain, water on the land, like rivers, lakes, streams, oceans, women's water, childbirth. Again, how do you govern that when people talk about water governance? They're not thinking about that. And that we are water, our tears, our sweat, our blood. So like literally we're water ourselves. So we think about water very differently, and that's generally not how people think about water when they're wanting to protect water, when they're thinking about drinking water. So I'll just go through this a little bit quicker than, again, I would like. So the elders thought that the reason why provincial, federal governments and others aren't getting it right is because the basis of how they know isn't traditional knowledge, and that's missing from the conversation. And they thought that was important and should be part of the conversation, because the traditional knowledge speaks to the responsibility, and if you understand that and everything else flows from that, then you start applying a very different logic and paradigm to how you think about your relationship to water. So one of the questions that we were asking elders at the time was, because the leadership at the time was really pushing for the recognition of traditional knowledge, but we actually hadn't asked the people who actually hold it what they thought of this. So that's partly what this exercise was, across Ontario, talking to different groups. And there are different nations, so we Haudenosaunee, Mushkegowuk Cree, Anishinaabe, so what their views were on this. And people were willing to share traditional knowledge because they think that it's needed, but not willy-nilly. Like there's rules around knowledge is governed in particular ways. Like it's not willy-nilly, anything's up for grabs. Like there's ways that knowledge would be shared appropriately. Partly because people have had their knowledge exploited as well and used inappropriately. So water is alive in life itself. They also spoke to the duality of water. So if you don't treat water properly, so if humans were contaminating water, then water can also take life if you're not respecting and treating water appropriately. Water is the lifeblood of Mother Earth is also another key teaching that came out, all waters need to be protected, not just water for drinking. They really made this point because, again, so much of the focus, the conversation is around drinking water, and that's important. But they're like, no, you have to think about all the water, again, that I had talked about earlier. I like this quote by Winona LaDuke. There's no way to quantify a way of life, only a way to live it. Because it's a very challenging knowledge to think about in the same way we think about knowledge in the way that we produce it in universities. Because it's a verb, you have to do something. You actually have to be responsible and you have to live it. So this speaks to the special relationship that women have in relation to water. And this was recognized that Sue will talk about follow-up work that she did later with the Hongwe, Anishinaabe and Métis Water Declaration. So a lot of these principles found their way into that province-wide or regional declaration. So what's important? So again, the messages that were coming was you actually have to be on the lands and waters, not just talk about it, but you actually have to be there to really know it, and for the lands and waters to actually know you as well, because it's a relationship or reciprocity. It's not one way. Learning by doing. So these are actually pictures from a workshop that Sue and I facilitated in Sault Ste. Marie Garden River on traditional knowledge of water, bringing elders and youth together on what they thought was important. So again, like really learning by doing, having that experience, that embodied knowledge was an important part of the message that they were sharing with us. So miigwech. So thank you for that. I know I went through that quickly, but you really do want to hear from Sue and Aimee.
Ogama no kwektikas, Jakdoram Chibigonzi Denpa, Anishinaabe-Métis. My English name is Chiblow. I introduced myself with my spirit name, clan, and where I'm from and who I am. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about Nibi Onje, and Onje means knowledge. When we talk about Onje, it's not just the knowledge you get out of a book, it's the knowledge of living your life, the knowledge from participating in ceremonies, from being on the land, from listening to your elders, from being with your families. All of this is all-encompassing knowledge. It's not just simply university knowledge. These pictures I have up on the screen is activities that I've participated in. Many of you may recognize the last three. Those are Isaac Murdoch's, as he calls them, doodles, and participating with them in water gatherings, participating in water ceremonies, but also 2 water awareness walks. So if I back up a little bit, I used to work for the Chiefs of Ontario for about 13 years, and in that work, what happened was the Chiefs of Ontario are governed by, well, they're not governed, but they do their work by resolution. So the chiefs all get together and say, this is important, draft a resolution, make an action plan, do something about it. And when I started with the Chiefs of Ontario, as their environmental coordinator, which was kind of like their director, there was nobody else in the environment sector. So when they called it a department, I used to always say, come on, please call me a unit, I don't want to be a department. But they had binders, those like big 6-inch binders full of resolutions, and they had about 4 or 5 of them. And this was supposed to be the environment. And I was absolutely overwhelmed. So in talking with an elder, we started talking, and they said, what comes first when you're born? Water pays your way out, and then you're born. So maybe start with water. So I separated all of the resolutions out and started working on water. And it was a good time to be doing this because government was in favor because of the Walkerton tragedy had happened. So of course, they're putting forth money to try and deal with this clean drinking water. And we held a series of water meetings. It started out with gathering TEK, like Deb had mentioned in some of the reports that are available online. And we went back again after we gathered all of the TEK, and we hosted another series of meetings asking them, this Clean Water Act was coming out. What are we going to do? What do we say? How do we participate in this? Do we participate in it? So what came out of that was the Water Declaration of the Anishinaabe-Métis and Ongwe. And there's a preamble, relationship to water, conditions of the waters, which really hasn't changed since 2008, it's still the same. The themes, the rights of water self-determination, the rights to water, and the treaties. All of this is still the same today. So in 2008, and what happened too, when I go and talk with the elders at these different sessions, the grandmas would say to me, "We already told you that. What did you do about it?" So I'd be like, "Well, technically you didn't really tell me, and I didn't really learn from it, and I don't want to read it out of a book, so if you can help me." So they would tell me again, and they emphasize the responsibility that once you get some knowledge, you have to do something with it. So we drafted the water declaration, and we started to draft an action plan on how to apply that, because there's so many different levels. You have the individual responsibility, you have your family responsibility, your community responsibility, your nation responsibility. It just keeps on building. So as an individual, what can I do to engage with my relationship with the water and be more responsible? This water declaration is also online. So what I did was, from working with the Chiefs of Ontario, I knew Elder Josephine Van and she was doing water walks. So she had contacted me, and she was doing the St. Lawrence water walk. So what Josephine did is she walked around every single Great Lake, creating an awareness of the conditions of the water, of our responsibilities to the water. And she's an elder, she's like 80, and she walked around every single one of these Great Lakes. So when she was doing the St. Lawrence Seaway, they were having problems with getting people to help. So she had called me and asked me if I could send out the word. So I sent out the word, and then I went there, and my daughter and I walked for 2 or 3 days with them, and then I had to go to a meeting. And from participating in those different water walks, she had called me again and said, "Do you know anybody up north who knows anything about water?" And I said, "Okay, well, what do you mean by up north, and where are we going?" And she said the Hudson Bay, the James Bay. So I said, well, I can put some information out and see who gets involved. And this was called the Four Directions Water Walk. So what we did was we walked from all of the four directions and met at, what's the name of that place? Where we met? No. We started out on Lake Superior, where the lodges are.
Bad River.
Yes, Bad River. We met in Bad River. So I was kind of voluntold that I needed to be the northern co-lead. And what we did was we went up to Churchill, we went up on a train, and I think 90% of the way there, what they explained to us is that it had gotten really warm, and that's all swamp and Mushkego up there. So the train was kind of wobbling, and they were worried that it was going to flip over. So they pulled us off of the train, put us on a plane, and sent us the rest of the way up there. Little did we know at the time that we were going to be stuck up there, because obviously the train couldn't make its way up there. But that was fine, because we ended up meeting people. We learned some history of the area. We were told a story that back in the 1940s, the army was up there. And this is in Churchill, Manitoba, and they were told not to build there by the locals because of the polar bear population. Of course, they didn't listen. They built it. They had an army base there. And when they decided to leave, they flew up or drove up great big excavators and just shoved everything right into the river, right into the bay, James Bay. So apparently people swim around down there. You can see all of that. Houses, cars, everything they shoved into the water. So it was an interesting stay. So what we did was we, as Josephine would call it, we orphaned the water from the bay, and it was May, so everything was still frozen up there. And we had to hire a guide because we were told not to go out on the ice because of the way the ice was breaking up, and then it would flip up like that, and so there's all kinds of dangerous areas, and I'm not familiar with those waters up there. So we hired a guide to bring us out, and we orphaned the water. We put it in a copper vessel, and we carried it back to our spot. In this one picture, there's Jay, myself, he carried the staff, and we brought it to the train station and touched down and waited for the train to show up. The train showed up about 3-4 days later, and the reason why we could tell the train was coming is because all of a sudden there was vehicles on the road everywhere, and everybody was going to the northern store. So obviously they knew somehow that the train was coming in. We got the train, and we drove, we caught the train down to Manitoba, and on the way down, watching outside, and I was like, geez, I think I could walk faster than the way this train is moving, and again, it had to go slow, but when I was laying down one night, and the train was wobbling like that, so I'm looking at my surroundings, and I'm like, okay, so this thing flips over on this side, I can get up this way, then it flips over this way, then I can get up this way. So I had a plan in my head on how I was going to escape if it flipped. But I don't know if any of you's canoe, if you've ever laid down in a canoe, it's like absolutely amazing because it's like you're inside a cradle. And that's how it felt on that train. So that night I was gifted a song, and I had met Josephine for breakfast, and she had wanted me to go on another direction because they were having a hard time finding people. And I told her that I couldn't because I was gifted a song. So every time I carried the water, I had to sing that song. It was like a lullaby. There were really no words. It's more of a chant. So it was my responsibility carrying that all the way. So we walked, and I'm like so thankful because we didn't walk that far. Like, you look at the eastern and the western direction, like they had to walk for months. We only had to walk for 1 month, so I was so grateful for that. But we ended up down at Bad River, Wisconsin, and the reason why it was explained to me why we're there is underneath, in Lake Superior, underneath there's these tectonic plates, so that's what the Western science calls it. But the local Anishinaabe people from that area knew that that was there and knew that was a special place. And the waters came from all of the direction and were poured into that area with the understanding that the waters would travel back, carrying that information that we had shared with them because, we had many occasions where we did talks on the water. We talked about how water is life. A lot of the things that the elders have said, our responsibilities to water, especially as women, we have more of a primary responsibility because we carry water. And every woman does this, so we can't just say this is Anishinaabe. This is a responsibility of women all over the world. And it was just really, every time we walked over a body of water, we made an offering. Part of that whole responsibility and being reciprocal and telling the water that, we appreciate the fact that it does provide us with life. And understanding too that the different personalities of each body of water. Josephine shared a lot of teachings when we were on the train because we were kind of stuck there, right? Couldn't really go anywhere. And she shared a lot of teachings about how each of the waters have a different personality. When she walked around each of the lakes, she understood the different personalities. And when she came to, I think it was Lake Ontario or Lake Erie, one of those smaller lakes of the Great Lakes, she said the water was very, very heavy. And when the scientists did their water sampling, they noticed that that lake was the most contaminated. And when she was carrying it, it was very heavy, and it was carried in a copper vessel. So this has led me into I've been kind of harassed, I'd say, for years by different people to get to school and do my PhD. So here I am in school now doing my PhD. And the research that I'm focusing on is water as medicine. We have been explained in our teachings that water has knowledge. Water knows how to govern itself. It's us who don't know how to govern our relationship towards water. Water as medicine, and water has our memories. You know how everybody says a blood relative or it's in your blood? Well, it's actually in your water. So understanding where you're from, where you live in terms of a space and what waters are there, helping you connect to that. And I'm in Anishinaabe from Garden River, which is located outside of Sault Ste. Marie, which is kind of like in the middle. There's a river that connects Michigan and Superior and Huron. And that's where my reserve box is. But our traditional territory encompasses down past Mackinac Island. My ancestor, Shinwak Host, actually signed treaties in the States and in Canada. So we didn't recognize that border back then. So understanding that I am from the Great Lakes watershed and mostly Michigan and Huron. So what I'd like to do is start to use all of this information that I gathered, do more research, and start to explain to people on how you can change your own individual water by how you treat the water that's around you, including your drinking water. And we have more recently some German scientists and a Japanese fellow that ended up passing on. He has a book called Memories of Water. And he proved what we've been saying all along, so they're catching up. So he proved how water can change depending on how you treat it. And if you look on the slide, he did Mozart, John Lennon, and then he showed how the water looks. So when you're saying something like, I'm going to kill you, look at how the water looks compared to when we say thank you. And so what I would like to do is expand on that, or on our knowledge, but also using theirs, and explain to people. So I do this teaching with kids. I try to do it with kids, but the adults can't put the kids out of the way. Is we buy glass water because Josephine always explained that if you wrapped your whole entire body in plastic, what would happen to you? You'd die. So when you're drinking water out of plastic, you're drinking dead water. So she always encouraged us to drink it out of a copper vessel or out of something else besides plastic. And plus she was trying to get people to get away from that water bottles, the plastic water bottles, especially Nestle, because it's not good. They're taking so much water. And so I do this exercise. I just buy these glass jars at the dollar store and a bunch of paint, and then I do a teaching with the kids, explaining to them that if they're having a bad day, they can paint their jar and put whatever they want on it and change their water, because the water can read what's there. And this came from, I don't know if you know those water bottles, it's called Smart Water. Well, when we were on the trips, in many areas, there's no access to clean drinking water, so people were bringing us water bottles. So of course I thought I was being smart one day, and I said, Josephine, look, I'm gonna get smart because I'm drinking smart water. So she's like, yeah, and if you had Anishinaabe-Métis words and our language, and part of it helping me to learn our language. So this is a lesson that I give to the kids, and they put those on their glass jars, and they prize them because the parents tell me how much they just love those glass jars. And it's funny because when I'm doing it, normally there'll be adults there and they're like, can I do a jar? It's like, yeah, and then they want to do two. And it's like, okay, I don't have so much that the kids do first. So this is kind of where I'm hoping to go with my research, and look forward to definitely learning a lot more about how our water is medicine and how it contains our memories and our knowledge.
Kiwezi no deni Queenish Nakas, Naki Queenish Nakas, Nagana no dem, and Tuapi and Donji. I'm really happy to be here today. I'm actually going to sit if that's okay. I think I'll still be able to see everyone. So we have limited time, so I'm going to take a little survey to know what you'd like to talk about. We can talk about water as a human right. We can talk about Anishinaabe law relating to water, or we can talk about methodologies of understanding our relationship to water. So, human right to water.
It's a test.
Anishinaabe not Kanagewin.
Yes.
Okay. And what was the third one?
Methodologies.
Methodologies. Methodology key. Okay. So I think we'll try and blend a little bit of all of it, because that's kind of how I work in practice. But we'll focus on Anishinaabe not Kanagewin, Anishinaabe-Métis not Kanagewin. And this idea of Nibi Onje Biimaadiiziiwin. So, I mean, there are so many things we could talk about today, and if I was doing a more academic talk, I'd probably speak to a human rights framework and how it's too limiting, because if we think of human rights, we forget our relationship to all of creation. And that's just not how Indigenous law is structured. It never has been, and it never will be. So using Western frameworks like human rights have really inherent limits. They can be important tools, don't get me wrong. And I think that in an international arena, human rights and human rights to drinking water are important. But as Deb mentioned, that's not how we think, that's not how we operate in our world, and so we have to be very conscious and aware of that. Right now, a lot of my work is thinking about spiritual sources of law and this concept of legal personhood of water. Okay? And even that, I think, is limiting. It's borrowing from Western concepts. And I want to start flipping that into Anishinaabe frameworks. So understanding rights of water as spirited entities, not only as a legal person like corporations, which are generally spiritless. I'm just going to put that out there. And thinking about water as something that's spirited, that has, that engages a particular relationship of normative obligations with us as Anishinaabe people, with all of us as human beings. Placing the water sort of at the center of that relationship and understanding that there are all these other relationships that exist despite, beyond our human relationship with water. So thinking about this as, you know, we're kind of, as humans in Western legal spheres, primary actors. In Anishinaabe law, we're kind of inconsequential in many ways, although we take up all this space, right? We make a lot of decisions as human beings, and it doesn't really give effect to all of the teachings that we have in terms of how we're supposed to govern ourselves as people within an Anishinaabe legal context. So that's kind of the overarching introduction to the kind of work that I'm doing, all of that coming from a perspective of having worked as a lawyer for 10 years and then shifting more into an academic realm, and working also in, not in silos, because, you know, often we're in these disciplinary silos, and my work is across disciplines, and you'll see incorporation of art quite a bit in the work that I do, and I think that there's real importance there, as well as language and a variety of other disciplines that are connected. So some people have, actually, colleagues have said, well, she doesn't really do law. And I'm like, thank you for the compliment. I appreciate that. I do, but it's more than. And that's how Anishinaabe and Canadian is actually structured. It's structured, it's more than law. It's how we govern our relationships between beings. And that means beyond human interactions. I recently published a paper in a publication called Braiding International, Domestic, and Indigenous Laws through the Center for International Governance and Innovation, and it's on UNDRIP Article 25. And I'll briefly mention Article 25 because, as Deb mentioned, and the great work that's being done, you know, on UNDRIP or the UNDRIP, Article 25 has a different flavor to it. It actually talks about the right to maintaining a sacred relationship, which doesn't exist in other sources of international law. So the right to maintain a sacred relationship and to preserve that relationship for future generations. So it's not actually talking about a right to do something or a right to something. It's a right to preserve a relationship, which is very unique in international law, for those of you who are lobbyists. Okay, so the other component to the work that I'm doing right now is around memory of water, but memory of persons and art. And so all of that comes together, and a lot of it is supported by the Decolonizing Water Governance Project that I help co-lead. Deb is also a member of the council for that grant, and it's a partnership grant over 7 years. So we're almost halfway through the grant life, and it's built this community of scholars, activists, community-based researchers and artists that are working together on issues that are identified relating to decolonizing our perspectives on water governance. And we're moving into a new phase of that grant, and I would encourage all of you to be in touch if you're interested in being part of that broader community. We're moving towards more engagement with community-defined research projects. Okay, so beyond what we might be interested in as scholars and activists and community, what are Indigenous communities, First Nations, other Indigenous organizations wanting to advance in terms of advocacy, and how can we be of assistance? Because any of us who go to ceremonies, who understand the Anishinaabe way of life, the question is always, how can I be of service, right? What can I do to help? And so that's the same approach in decolonizing our relationship with water. So, situating ourselves is really important. Sue mentioned this. I come from Treaty 1 territory, so I define my jurisdiction in relation to my treaty territory. That's my primary set of responsibilities, is those people and beings within my treaty territory, the land that I belong to, which is in southern Manitoba. I also see my jurisdiction as related to the Lake Winnipeg watershed. We've already talked about, like, relationships with water exist on many scales. We can think of the water within our bodies as our primary water relationship, and changing that relationship or enhancing or improving that relationship with the water in our bodies. sometimes people think we need blood to live, right? Blood is the source of our life. And okay, we have 4 times more water in our body than we do blood. So thinking about, 70 to 80% of our body is composed of water, and what's our relationship with that water? And is that water healthy? And where's that water coming from, and where is it going to? So starting with that first relationship and building outward to those multiple other relationships, and defining these jurisdictions and responsibilities. I've often spoken to the jurisdiction around water being fragmented. Okay, so the law, Western legal systems, Canadian law, treats water in a variety of different ways. And if someone said, like, who has responsibility for water in a Western legal context in Canadian law, the answer is, how much time do you have? And like, how brave are you to start to tackle that question, because it is so fragmented. And that's the problem with asking that kind of question, is that we think in these silos of water as a resource, as though it's something to be owned and managed, and like we can make the decisions on behalf of this thing called water. Instead of understanding that it is flowing, it is a variety of things, it's in us, it's outside of us, it governs life, and really it is independent of us and makes decisions, like Sue was saying, independent of our interaction with it, right? It can decide for itself. So thinking of jurisdiction, instead of I get to decide or control, what's my responsibility? And that's the framework of Anishinaabe law that flips that. Not what do I control, but what do I have a responsibility to and for? Okay, so this is where I see my responsibility is in the Lake Winnipeg watershed, which is about 1 billion square kilometers, second largest watershed in Canada, and the 10th largest freshwater lake in the world. Okay, for those of you who are from the Great Lakes, it doesn't seem that exciting. But it spans over 4 provinces and 4 US states, which is interesting because of that fragmented jurisdiction. We're sharing in a lot of geopolitical spaces that are not ours as Anishinaabe people. And it's also, and this is the piece I want you to retain, the 3rd largest hydroelectric reservoir in the world. So Lake Winnipeg is basically Manitoba Hydro's watershed. And this is what I grew up understanding and thinking and knowing is the impact of hydroelectric development within our territory. So I have some really important water quality issues and water diversions coming up from the US, but the big impact is hydroelectric development. And these are all the power stations in Manitoba. 16 generating stations, 3 control structures, 2.3 billion in annual revenue for Manitoba Hydro, and it's a crown corporation. And we've had dams built since the early 1900s, so just a few, 30 years after the creation of the province of Manitoba, to the point where some of them have been decommissioned. This one was decommissioned in 1950, so we have this long legacy of hydro where I'm from. And my mushroom actually helped build some of these hydro dams, 2 of them that he worked on. And his acknowledgement was that this participated in the destruction of our community and way of life. And that's a heavy burden to bear, but it also engages how we think about that responsibility to water. And why is that important? Well, we have 5,000 megawatts of power generated in Manitoba, but the potential for another 5,000. Okay, so we think the landscape has changed now, and we think about how hydroelectricity is built as clean energy. We have the potential to severely impact our landscapes and relationships with water within our province in a very dramatic way in the coming years. So that's what I'm thinking about. And I think about this dichotomy between Western legal systems that are totally centered on individualism and protection of private property, and the contrast or conflict that has with how we think about Anishinaabe law, right? Inakwanagewin, which is our relationships meant to achieve or strive towards a collective sense of well-being. And we can, I put this up in a slide like this so we can see the absolute contrast between the two, right? And we structure our law in this way, not as bilateral relationships. And if there are any lawyers in the room, like you have one party often suing another party, and then we actually have a special category called third parties, and you have to apply to somehow be part of the conflict. and someone decides outside of the conflict if you are actually part of the conflict. Okay, so this is not quite like that. It's this big messy web of relationships where my relationship as an Anishinaabe person with water is connected to the water's relationship with fish and birds and in all these permutations of relationships. So we have to think in this broader web, and people say think holistically, but think in a circle. Whatever it is, I think this is a big, messy, but really fantastic way of thinking about the world and thinking about law and those sets of responsibilities and relationships. And how do we understand those relationships? Well, some people might say, well, go and ask. It's kind of abstract to sit with plants and ask them, but we do that. We do that as part of our ceremonies. We do that as part of our medicine picking. But we understand it also through these different sets of instructions that start with a spiritual core. And that's what I was mentioning at the beginning of my comments is right now I'm focusing on understanding how we come to this spiritual understanding, because we're born of water and we are made of water. So we have a set of instructions and normative values that are ingrained in us, encoded in us. And how do we then act on those responsibilities within this broader set of relationships, and taking into account that, nature has been doing this for a really long time, despite us, with us. And there are laws of nature that have developed over time that we can observe. And this is also how we learn a lot of our legal normative values. And then the customary law that has been built around that for thousands of years. And this last outer layer, which Western law thinks is really important, which is human lawmaking, is actually less important in its very contextual, and it's actually not where we go find most of our normative obligations in law. Okay. So understanding this as a different structure of legal theory is really important because it helps us define those relationships that both Sue and Deb have been talking about, right? What is that relationship that we have? And that relationship in the context of what are our responsibilities to water in all its different forms. And one of the big questions I've been asking lately is about recognition of legal personhood of water has been so far on the basis of waterways, right? Rivers. So flowing rivers from one place to another that are kind of geopolitically bounded in some ways. We know that water courses change over time, but generally a sense that this is the body of water that we're talking about. And how do we think about relationships with water that are not that easy to define? Like, for example, that spiritual relationship with water and the water within our body. And how do we navigate that? How do we tackle that from an Anishinaabe legal perspective? Rather than just recognizing it in Western legal systems. And so I'm going to skip through a bunch of slides that are all about Indigenous law and reconciliation and talk about when we come into conflict between those systems that I was showing. These are all pictures of Standing Rock. And I used this to illustrate conflicts of laws, which in international law, there are all these rules that deal with conflicts of laws. Something happens involving different jurisdictions. How do we manage that conflict in law? And here, what I'm proposing is that actually Standing Rock was not an issue of civil disobedience or trespass or different cultures, different values. This is a question of conflict of laws. Water protectors saying water is life. We have an obligation to stand up for the water, speak for the water, and do it passively in accordance with the grandmother's instructions that helped set up the camp in Standing Rock, camps, and state law. And we see it physically in this middle picture. We see two systems of law coming up against each other. So what do we do in a context of conflict of laws? Which law do we respect? Right? Because we know that water protectors were arrested. There was no legal action taken against the people that are enforcing state law. They're doing it in the context of their job, and it's sort of a dominant Western colonial context. So they're protected by the colonial imposition of power and the colonial imposition of law within that particular context. So there is, and I like this picture because it illustrates, the hierarchy in which Western societies place our systems of law. And so the question is, how do we actually rise up and understand Anishinaabe law and other Indigenous legal traditions as being valuable when we're starting to think about these relationships with water? And here are some examples of where legal personhood and legal agency of water have been recognized. My question is, again, what can we do outside of Western legal systems to recognize that relationship and that responsibility to water? And I think part of the answer, and I know I'm running short on time, is maintaining that responsibility to water. This is our Bush University. This is our Nibi gathering. Every May we have this gathering, and you'll see a cast of characters in this photo that are standing or sitting here. And this project started as part of a broader project on First Nations and drinking water, which I'm going to do just a little sidebar. If any of you can think about clean drinking water and issues, go look at the Globe and Mail's recent article on Garden Hill First Nation in northern Manitoba. It's actually quite powerful, because Garden Hill is not going to get a better water treatment plant. The water treatment plant is fine. It's in the delivery and storage of water and some of the problems that it's causing within the First Nation. And the Island Lakes communities have been suffering from unsafe drinking water. Actually, there's old people in their 80s walking down to the water and getting water out of the lake every day, like having to walk in third world conditions in Canada. But that's actually not a First Nation that's a priority for the current government, because the plant is great. Again, coming back to your point, there's these policies that are in place that just don't have effect on the ground. So the Anishinaabe-Métis research objectives, we really wanted to move past colonial language of ownership and idea of protecting rights, and just work within our own legal system and understanding these principles that were brought forward by the elders and working together in these gatherings. So through art and assembly and creating together, assembling together, and developing relationships. And if I can, I don't know how we're doing for time. If I can take, is that okay? So just explain, part of the water gathering has been working with visual artist and performance artist Casey Adams. And these are little clay pots that were filled with water that had been prayed on, that we had worked with. And we asked people to fill their little clay pots and to place them on the ground. There were about 300 pots, 50 or 60 people placing them. And we placed them randomly. And what ended up happening is we created the shape of a petriform of a turtle. And this is a site, the Manitoba site where we have the water gathering, is a site of petriforms, and actually there's a bunch of turtles around the site. And so it was really interesting that somehow the spirit of that water had guided us collectively and individually to create the shape of a turtle, which is actually quite significant in terms of Anishinaabe law and understanding Debwaywen, or truth or justice. And so when we went back to the site a year after that, we noticed all of these little turtle eggs. So turtles had come and hatched on the exact place where the petriform had been formed the year before in the ceremony. So hundreds of little turtle eggs, which was absolutely amazing. Then we started making pots with Casey's help and firing them, creating them and firing them in a way, a traditional way, with songs. And women and men having different roles. And what was neat was Casey, actually, I was interviewing her for a film, and walking down to the water, she found clay shards that are hundreds, if not thousands of years old, that had been placed on the water's edge by, don't know who. When we looked for more, we have never found more in that area, but little shards that had come up from the water. So that recognition that water probably placed those there for her to find and say, you're on the right path. This is a really important part of the activity. And this clay and the name Wajishke is connected to that name for the muskrat, okay, Wajish, which is part of our original creation story. So if you think of what's happening in that context and you think beyond sort of linear thoughts, you can see that in this creation story, we have these elements of water, turtle, clay, and the muskrat, all connected to each other. And this is an amazing opportunity then to transmit those stories, not necessarily as law-making exercises, but sharing law and those sets of instructions, which we can sit with the people that attend the gathering and say, this is the creation story, these are your responsibilities to all of creation. And this is not just us telling you this is the land actually showing you this through the context of these gatherings. And remembering why we do it, right, for these little people. All forms of little people. Basic, and then our little people, our young people, our next generation that are coming up. So I have a lot more that I could share, and I hope that we can have a good discussion. I really appreciate working with Deb and Sue and JC. They have been attending the water gathering. I would invite all of you to come and participate, and actually participate in lodge building, which is put your hands on the lodge and help build it. We're doing that in April. I'm willing to share any information that you need to be able to do that. Yes, so you've been to the water gathering too. Yeah. It's an amazing opportunity to do that work for the water, and I think that that's the work that we all have in common, and our friend Sylvia too, is like, you're working, you do this work not because you have to, although Sue, we see you get voluntold all the time. And it's not really a choice, but it's a privilege actually to be called upon to do that work. So I'm looking forward to questions and the discussion, and for being here and for being attentive.